Uh, so just continuing on the idea, and I think this is the paper with Robin that you mentioned, the idea of reconstitution and how it affects stock prices. Can you talk about how the price effects of index inclusions and deletions have changed over time?
Yeah, but first I want to give a little bit of a history lesson, I guess, and just go back in time to the 70s. So, back in the 70s, economists and finance people thought a lot about how prices should respond to pure demand shocks. In the sense that, like, well, my friend who gathered information on RVs and then buys a stock, he has information. And so when he buys it, you could imagine that prices should adjust. But an index fund buying a stock based on a mechanical rule like the Russell 1000 or 2000, it doesn't necessarily have information. And so Sharpe has this like famous paper from the 70s saying that like you can buy for with no information as much of a stock as you want and the price should never move. Now, in the 80s, Andre Schleifer has this really famous paper called Do the Demand Curves for Stocks Slope Down? And he showed that when stocks get added to the 500, prices go up, saying a totally non-informational demand shock, possibly non-informational demand shock, moves prices a lot. And then people refined that result. They show, oh, well, it doesn't actually happen when it gets added to the index. It shows that it happens when we announce that it's getting added to the index. That was like in the 90s, we figured that out. And like, okay, the demand shocks really, really matter. Well, what Robin and I show that the effect of being added to many indices, the S&P 500 is their main focus, but we also have in the later tables the Russell 1000, 2000, and various other indices, have essentially gone to zero over time. Speaking about the return from the announcement, to be very precise, the return from the day before the announcement to the day after the implementation, those effects have gone to zero.
So what do your findings suggest about why the index effect has declined?
Right. And so this goes back to what we've kind of been hinting at a little bit before is one possibility is that I think I read this article, I think it was in Bloomberg and the New York Times, suggesting that one of these large investment banks had a 20-person team that was making like $200 million a year, front running index additions, right? They're not waiting until the announcement to buy. They're buying ahead of time. And so this suggests that the old way of measuring it by looking from the announcement to the implementation is just looking in the wrong place. That's one possibility. Second possibility is that, and something we talk about in the paper, is that S&P does not want, and don't quote me, but my understanding is that S&P doesn't want a lot of volatility around these events, right? They don't want it to be that every time a stock gets added or dropped, prices go really, really wild. Yeah. That also might make it hard for the people who are paying them for the right to license their index names to track indices if we have huge volatility around these events every time. Mm-hmm. And so what Robin and I find is that over time, we've had more and more migration. So in the modern era, when a stock gets added to the 500, a lot of times now it comes from the 400. And importantly, the tracking dollars has also been increasing over time. So, the way index funds work, and this is something that I think is kind of interesting, in a weird way, indexing is kind of a fixed point problem. The weights are determined ex post, right? We take the total float adjusted cap, we take the AUM of your fund, and you buy a constant percentage of the float adjusted cap of every constituent. So if 400 funds own about 7% of every constituent's float adjusted cap, and 500 funds, which use the same float adjustment, own about 7%, when you move from the 400 to the 500, those two demand shocks offset, and the net demand shock is zero. And if the net demand shock is zero, why would prices move? And finally, you can imagine that, over the last 30 years, like if you look at some of the data from the 80s, like on like just even simple stuff like bid-ask spreads, or you look at like, how much prices move 5 minutes after an order, like markets were much less illiquid. I mean, we had pieces of 8, like based on like the pirate code, right? Like we didn't have decimalization until I think around 2002 is when we fully had decimalization. Like markets have just become a lot more liquid, and like people understand these huge events are coming. Russell, I think, has like a huge party every year. I've talked to people who work there who like they celebrate this like it's a holiday. Like these things have become focal, and markets have likely adapted to how focal these huge index events are.
That's so crazy. The migration thing is super interesting. It's like more assets being in index funds reduces price effect because stuff's just migrating from one index fund to the other.
Exactly. You move from one to the other. It's like literally, the demand shocks could perfectly offset. And actually, we've seen sell-side reports, like many investment banks for their clients will publish lists of like possible adds to the 500. So like a merger happens, a slot opens up, and then they're like, oh, these are the most likely adds. They also have a notional expected demand shock in these reports. And if you look at these reports, you'll see that like the notional demand shock for the migrations is tiny. So like market participants, like, going back to the Grossman-Stiglitz kind of rational expectations equilibrium, everyone knows what the migrations are, everyone knows that those, if you go back to our other thing, they're both going to submit market on close, market on close, market on close buy, market on close sell. Those things are going to offset and have very little effect on prices.
Yeah, that's crazy. What would you say the implications are of the findings in this paper for market efficiency?
So now let me ask you a question. What is market efficiency?
It's a great question. I don't have the answer.
Cameron, you want to take a try at it?
I will let you take it, Professor.
Well, I think, and maybe we can talk about this more, because I've worked on this before. I actually think measuring price efficiency, whatever that means, is really hard.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons it's really hard is that it kind of assumes that you have some way to know what a stock is worth at any given point in time. And there's, I guess, two things I'd say kind of on this front. So one is, suppose I tell you, you go around, you figure out, you drive, how many RVs they sold, how many, if they sold 10 more RVs than you thought, like, what does that translate into the value of the company? Is that a persistent shock to RV sales? Is it a temporary shock to RV sales? Like, I think even people whose job it is to predict how much stocks are worth, that's a really hard job, and it's a really hard over the long run. And the second thing is the horizon, right? So suppose you believed even back in the 80s that, like, when a stock gets added to an index, prices go up and then they go back down. Like, okay, so for 2 weeks prices were high, and then, like, for 2 weeks 2 weeks later prices went back down. Like okay, maybe it was inefficient or prices moved away from fundamentals for 2 weeks, but, like, is the company now suddenly, like, not functioning? Are they not investing? Like, is it having real implications because prices were temporarily distorted? Is it any different than, like, if, I don't know, Elon Musk needs to sell 100 million shares of Tesla and that pushes the price down a little bit while that demand gets absorbed? Like, this is a really kind of tricky area, I guess.
That's like the joint hypothesis problem, right? Where any test of market efficiency is a test of your model and a test of market efficiency.
Right. That's a really, really good way of putting it. And I guess I don't want to call people out, but I'll just give a really great example of this. There are two really famous papers, or one that's published. They're both published very well. I don't want to give too much information. One of them measures efficiency by regressing future fundamentals on current prices, essentially. And what that's saying is, well, if prices are a better predictor of future fundamentals, that suggests that the market is more efficient. Like, that's kind of intuitive, right? Another paper by two people I know, which has a different model of the data generating process of the world, flips the right-hand side and left-hand side and says, okay, do fundamentals predict prices? And they're saying, well, the logic is that, well, if fundamentals are the key driver of, or should be the key driver of prices, we want to figure out how much of the variation in prices is determined by fundamentals and not vice versa. So we've now taken the same variables and swapped the right-hand and left-hand side. This is kind of like trying to measure supply and demand by regressing prices on quantities and then quantities on prices, right? In some model, it makes sense to do one. In some model, it makes sense to do the other. It can't make sense to do both, especially if you believe that, like, you need shifts to the supply curve to estimate the demand curve, right? You need shifts to the demand curve to estimate the supply curve. Like, it's like it's actually a much bigger problem even. But yes, you put it very well with the joint hypothesis problem.